Everybody ready? Yes. Very good. Well, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you for braving this cold weather. I think it's kind of warm in here, though. Is everybody okay? Everybody's acclimating, so thank you. Welcome to the Fraser History Museum and our program today, Kentucky Quilts and Quiltmakers. I'm Rachel Platt. I'm the Vice President of Mission here at the Fraser. What an impressive group we have up here with us today. First, the author of Kentucky Quilts and Quiltmakers, 3 Centuries of Creativity, Community, and Commerce, Linda LaPinta, right here. Also joining, applause is good. Also joining us, and I know so many of their friends are in the audience, and I'm loving it, 2 wonderfully talented quilt artists who brought some of their works with them today. Sunshine Joe Mallard and his fan club and family, and MJ Kinman, who also have family and friends and fans. Both are featured in Linda's book, as well as many others. Some of them are in the audience today. We're going to be pointing some others out a little bit later in this program. We also just want to make sure, as you leave, the Fraser's Tish Boyer, where she's right there, okay. She is our collections manager. She has some quilts from our collection. So as you leave the program today, make sure to stop by and talk to Tish about some of the quilts that we have. And also, that will be a time for Linda. If you have a book and you want her to sign it, she'll do it after the program, just so you want to know. We want to begin, though, with a poem from Kentucky's Bell Hooks. It is the way that the book begins that Linda has. If you have it, you can turn to the front. I was just going to read it. I think it's just a great way to start the program. Star of David, Tree of Life, double wedding band, a 9-patch, such patterns once shaped our destiny. Pieces of cloth marking a woman's life, sewn together scraps, bits and pieces tell us life stories. Piece by hand, remnants of passion, an unfulfilled desire. Sisters coming together, making peace, offering comfort, ways to warm, to open hearts. And again, I thought, what a beautiful way to start the program and a beautiful way to start the book. Because as we all know, quilts tell stories. The Quilt Alliance asked that all-important question: if this quilt could talk, what would it say? That question is going to be coming up for some of our artists today. Quilts, as we know, capture times and places and the lives of the people who make them. They capture slices of life and slices of history. Sunshine Joe and MJ will talk about what their quilts captured in just a bit. But first we want to start with Linda and her journey to write this book and the lens from which she wrote it. First of all, how the book came about. Kentucky's role, as we know, is so pivotal in quilting. But we want to point out, this is not from the perspective of a quilt artist or a quilt maker, but as a writer. And I was shocked to find out no such book had really ever happened before. So were you.
Yes. Probably
tell us a little bit how it came about.
Well, I have published 4 other books with the University Press of Kentucky, 3 related to Kentucky writers, and 1 about a group of Kentucky women who were imprisoned for being convicted of killing or conspiring to kill their longtime batterers. Those women made a quilt while in prison that depicted scenes of their abuse, visuals so strong that then Governor Brereton Jones had the parole board reinvestigate their cases, which resulted in 9 of those women being paroled and later pardoned. An acquisitions editor at the University Press asked whether I would consider writing a comprehensive book concerning Kentucky quilts and quilt makers. Given that quilts are as emblematic of Kentucky as bourbon and horses, my first response was to reply, surely that's been done. What I soon found out was that the 2 previously published Kentucky quilt books, although both filled with significant information, stopped short of my goal. John Finley and Jonathan Holstein's Kentucky Quilts 1800 to 1900 ends as the 20th century begins. And Mary Washington Clark's Kentucky Quilts and Their Makers focuses on particular quilt makers in the central and western parts of the state. Since I am a writer, not a quilt maker, just as I have been a longtime educator interested in approaching historical subjects through an interdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary lens, I saw writing this book as an opportunity to shift my focus from a how-to approach to making quilts and listing pattern names, both of which can be found in numerous other books, to viewing quilts as material culture conduits of social history that have embodied and that still constitute powerful art, objects that create and engage community and promote substantial commerce. I also thought it essential to indicate in my book how Kentucky's quilts and quilt makers fit into and often forged the way for what was occurring on the quilt scene nationally. As I write in my introduction, in addition to focusing on ways in which the Commonwealth's quilts and quilt makers have mirrored and often shaped significant aspects of the national quilt scene, Kentucky Quilts and Quilt Makers also serves as a compendium of tales about real women and men who have created quilts, organization, enterprises, and movements. What's more, I delineate that the many quilt firsts that occurred in Kentucky, most of which have been adopted nationally and internationally. Among them are the first statewide quilt project led by Shelley Ziegert and Eleanor Bingham Miller, the American Quilter Society with its many quilt shows and publications, founded by Meredith and Bill Schrader, the Paducah Museum that became the National Quilt Museum of the United States, numerous other landmark exhibitions, and a wide variety of quilt makers and entrepreneurs who are recognized for their quilt making and marketing genius.
A lot to unpack there. But one thing in your book, so many of these wonderfully talented quilt artists are featured. We have two with us, so we want to hear from you all and a little bit how you got into quilt making. And Joe, we'll start with you. First of all, I say Sunshine Joe. I was lucky enough to do stories on you when I worked in TV. Yes. So when I heard you were coming, and MJ, who I've met both of you before and just adore, this was just such a treat. So let's talk first about the nickname before we get into how you got into this, just so when people, I say Sunshine Joe, they know.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for having MJ and myself here to be a part of this significant
we're thrilled.
occasion.
Thank you.
And I want to thank Linda for including us in your book. It's a milestone in my mind. Now to my nickname, Sunshine Joe. I was in a classroom with fifth graders, and when I finished, this little girl said to me, "May I give you a nickname?" And I said, "Yes, what would that be?" She said, "Sunshine Joe." And I said, "Okay, why would you call me Sunshine Joe?" She said, "The sunshine brings light, and you do too, so I want to call you Sunshine Joe." And that just stuck out. It stuck with me. I was at another school, and I had a moose puppet talking to a third grade class. And when I finished, this one little girl stood up and she said, "May I give you a nickname?" I said, "Yes, what would that be?" And she said, "J, Moose, Sticking Needle." And I said, "Why would you call me J, Moose, Sticking Needle?" She said, "Your first name is Joe, and we'll use your first initial. You seem to love your puppet, and you stick your needle when you work, so I'll call you J, Moose, Sticking Needle." And that very day, I went home and I named my studio Moose Farm USA. And since that time, when I work with kids, I have developed 10 camoosments. And I brought those with me today. I brought some of those with me today, and maybe we can share as time goes on.
We're showing some of your quilts behind us. You brought some. We're going to have you and MJ get up later and talk about those quilts. But let's talk about how you got into the art of quilt making. And a lot of that goes back to your grandmother and lessons she taught you, but it wasn't until later kind of that all came together.
Absolutely. When I was a young child, I was born in the southwestern part of the state of Mississippi, and I was born in the height of the Jim Crow era. And you can look at me now and tell I must have been a skinny child when I was And nobody wanted me to play on their basketball team or play on their football team. And I would walk home from school feeling very rejected because, first of all, I couldn't drink from the white water fountains and I couldn't go into the white waiting rooms. I was rejected there. But my classmates did not want me to play basketball. So I would come home to my great-great-grandmother who lived in my home, and she was a former slave. And I would tell her how rejected I felt and how nobody wanted me on their team. And I can hear her speaking to me now. She would pull me close and she says, honey, don't worry about what other people say you cannot do. But I want you to find something and I want you to do it. And I said, oh. So I joined the band. It wasn't until when she allowed me to thread her needles because she was 90-some years old. And her eyesight was dim and she let me thread her needles. I had no idea that I would grow up and make quilts. So when I was about 25, maybe 28 years old, I saw Rosie Greer on the Mike Douglas show.
Everybody remember Rosie Greer? Okay.
So I said, if a great big guy like that can do it, a little skinny guy like me can do it. And I went out and bought needle and thread, embroidery floss, and an embroidery hook. And I just started stitching. And I would stitch on my friends' clothes and my clothes and my children's clothes. And finally, when Jimmy Carter was president, I embroidered the back of a shirt that chronicled his political life from Plains, Georgia to Washington, D.C. And I went to Washington, D.C. without an appointment to see President Carter. And through Senator Walter D. Huddleston's office, I was able to get the shirt to President Carter. That shirt is now in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Later in my life, this is where the first quilting came in. When Barack Obama became President of the United States of America, I decided that I wanted to chronicle the first 4 years of his administration. And I wrote sketches of things that were going on at the time because I couldn't stitch that fast. And I would get up in the middle of the night and stitch and write and stitch. And when I finished the quilt, I met MJ. And MJ actually quilted it for me. I brought that quilt today.
And it's behind you too, Joe.
Yeah, you can see it. You'll see, I have the actual quilt here today. And my hope is that a philanthropist will purchase this quilt and present it to Barack Obama to be in his presidential library. That is my dream. I don't know if it will ever happen, but to chronicle that first 4 years was a great experience in my life.
So if anyone has any connections in this audience, we want you to utilize them for sure. I love that, and how it really came back full circle with those lessons from your grandmother, who at the time you had no idea that you would be quilting later.
At all. But that's why it's so important that we plant seeds in children's minds. And we'll talk about that later, the seeds that I try and plant in the minds of children through quilting.
All right, MJ, any nicknames we need to know about?
MJ, that's my nickname.
That's your nickname.
Yeah. Don't ask me what it stands for. It's Martha Jane, just don't tell anybody.
Okay, just don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
So tell us your journey to because it didn't start with you being a quilt artist.
Right. And again, thank you so much for having us. And I just want to add, if I may, just to follow on with what you were saying, Sunshine Joe, is that when I first met Joe, he was beginning work on that incredible tie quilt. And I got to watch it blossom and bloom as he worked on it over the years. And I'm rarely speechless. But when he would come to my home and unwrap it, it was just, you just know how many thousands of hours of those little teeny tiny knots. And I knew this was something very, very special. And when you look at it, you'll see, if you don't mind me explaining this a little bit, words like love, patience, kindness, compassion, grace, etc. These are the things that Miss Mandy Green, your grandmother, instilled in you,
Yes.
and then you put them in the quilt. And I have to say that Joe exemplifies all of those things. So
Thank you.
it's just a wonderful thing to be able
Yes.
to do.
And then, did you want to add to that? I just thought it might be good if we could clarify for the audience, anybody who might not know, what the difference between quilting your quilt and designing the quilt. I don't know that people know the difference between quilting, quilters and quilt makers, and what that distinction is.
I'll take a stab at it. Quilts are 3 layers. There's the top, the batting, and the backing, right? And you can quilt it. You can actually put a stitch through each one of those layers in a number of ways. You can actually hand quilt it through all 3 layers. You can use a machine, whether it's a domestic small machine or a long arm machine, or you can tie it. You can actually take little yarn and tie it off at the top. Those are a couple of ways of doing quilts. I think Joe you have a little bit special way of designing your quilts, because basically mine are 3 layers, pieced together on the top, the batting, and then the backing. Joe has a little bit different way of creating your pieces.
Yes, I watched my great-great-grandmother make quilts, and she never used a pattern, but she chose bright, brilliant colors, and she just put these things together. And she and a group of other women would come together and just make these quilts, and they would quilt the top, and then they would stretch them on these long things about as big as this table, and they would sit around it and they would stitch. And as you were saying, the top, the batting, and then the back, but they would stitch all the way through it, and it was all by hand. So what I do, I create the top of my quilt completely. And then there's a very good friend of mine who's here today, Angelique Shaw. I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you stand? I can bring her the raw finished product, and what she does to make the quilt ready to show is absolutely amazing. So yes, I agree with you. There are several ways to do it, but I think mine is totally different than most.
And then, MJ, let's go back to your journey a little bit, though. How you came to do works such as this gorgeous one. I'm like, oh, what a backdrop for me. Thank you. I love that. So tell us your
It's
journey.
lucky to have you at home. I learned how to sew when I was about 8 years old, 4-H. Okay, this whole journey is the tragic result of way too much 4-H in my life, right? My mom and I we wanted to quilt, to learn to quilt. I was a poor social worker when I first got out of college, and I lived in these dingy apartments, and I knew that I wanted to have quilts on my walls as art, something that would add light and color and softness and texture, just a coziness. And so when my mom, who was a visiting nurse, had a friend of hers who was also a visiting nurse, said that she would love to teach us how to make quilts, because Gay Nordvik is her name, and she used to live here in Louisville. She was an incredible applique, meaning she took pieces of fabric and then stitched them onto a top, and then by hand. And I'm like, okay, you appliqueurs are amazing. I'll be a piecer, okay? But she taught us how to match our points and put our binding on, and I was hooked, absolutely hooked. I knew I had found my wheelhouse, I guess. And after that, it kind of consumed my life. As I mentioned, I always wanted to have quilts on the walls. Yes, I do use quilts in my house as functional bed quilts, but I just love the softness, the color, the texture, and what it can bring to a room, a space, to warm it up and brighten it up.
Tell us a little bit. This one is called Eclipse, correct?
This is called Eclipse 2020. This quilt is, it's a little bit bigger here than it is. It's about 60 by 60. It was created for a traveling show that was sponsored by equilter.com, which is in Boulder, Colorado. Luana Rubin is the owner there, and she was planning a traveling show of quilts that commented on the climate crisis, and it was called For the Love of Gaia. And so I put this together. I chose 2 gemstones. Obviously, my love is making quilts that look like faceted gems and colored diamonds. And so I picked a beautiful pair, Eva tourmaline, to represent the earth, and then a black diamond. There are creatures called black diamonds that are just fabulous. They're filled with all sorts of wonderful inclusions of hematite and things like that, which makes them very brittle, so it takes a long, long time to cut them, and they're very rare and very expensive, very precious for that reason. And I use that as kind of the symbol of maybe the concern, the planetary crisis that's coming towards us. We can still get away, but we need to do something fast. So
And
that's
then
what I have.
this next one, I think, is just breathtaking as well. I mean,
Thank you.
is that not amazing?
Thank you. That's
mean-
Lila. She actually was made with all commercially available fabrics. The one before I did the pair of Eva tourmaline, I hand paint my fabric. I don't dye my fabric because I don't have the water and the materials and the equipment that needs it. And also when you dye your fabric, when you put that fabric in a dye bucket, the dye gods take over, right? And you get what you get when you pull it out. I'm kind of a control freak, and so I like to have more control over the flow of light and color across the facets. And so I paint a lot of my pieces. This, however, is mostly commercially available fabrics. I did her from chart to finish in about 8 days. I'm very motivated by shame and deadlines. And so this was done for a friend's opening of her jewelry shop. So
That is gorgeous. And then this one, of course, this one is on display, is at Maker's Mark.
Yes. Back in 2017, I had my quilts at a wonderful event. Some of you who love bourbon should come and visit it. It's called it's the Women's Bourbon Association, or Bourbon Women's Association, and they have their annual symposium, but they call it their sip-posium. And I love that. I think that's great. So I brought my quilts there because I have a series called the Bourbon Diamonds, and I thought, why not? And this gentleman came up and he goes, oh, at our gallery, at our distillery, we have a lot of artists who display their work. And I said, well, let's talk more. And so it was Rob Samuels of Maker's Mark, and he commissioned a piece, and that's the piece that I did for him. It's called Maker's Flame. It's about 9 feet tall, about 4.5 feet wide, and I think it's about 900 pieces of, I think I hand painted that fabric.
And how long, it's beautiful, yes. How long did that take you?
I was kind of under deadline too with that one. It took me about 6 weeks.
Oh my gosh. And I know, Joe, the Obama quilt, how long did that one take?
5 years.
Oh my gosh.
5 years. And, I was telling one lady here today, she said she didn't have patience. I don't either. I'm obsessed.
5 years is patience.
Yeah, right.
That's patience. I know, Linda, you had a passage you wanted to read, because I think one thing that we feel is the admiration that our two quilt artists have for one another. And I think you had something you wanted to read that kind of speaks to that a little bit.
Yeah, I wanted to read a little bit about both of them, and one reason that I invited Joe and MJ to do this with me is because I knew about their friendship. And really this book is filled with all kinds of friend and friendship associations between quilters across the state and nationally. And I think that it's been really a wonderful part of my research to find out about all these special friendships and how quilt makers support each other in such wonderful ways. So, one thing, this might be a little bit redundant because MJ's already touched on this, but I wanted to read something that when I interviewed MJ, she told me about Joe. Joe and I had been collaborating on local projects for about 15 years. During that time, we'd keep each other posted on our plans and kick around ideas for new ones. One day in mid-2009, I'll never forget it, he unwrapped a canvas during one of our meetings. When I realized what I was looking at, I literally couldn't speak. Joe had filled about a quarter of the canvas with thousands of densely packed French knots in waves of glowing color. The names of people, places, and events were carefully stitched over the appliqued neckties, every one of them a reference to an event that had happened over the past few months. Even though it was far from finished, I knew I was looking at a masterpiece. Over the next 4 years, I had the extreme privilege of watching that canvas bloom. I couldn't stop thinking about what a treasure the Obama tie quilt was, so I asked Joe if he'd allow me to compile a list of all the references it contained. We received funding from the American Quilt Study Group, and over the course of the next few months compiled a list of stitched references section by section. It was such a joy and honor to complete that work. I also wanted to read for a second here.
Is this the next quilt that we were going to talk about, the one behind us this? No, okay. I'm ahead.
This is the MJ's, a tale from MJ's Block of the Month Club. This is Evelyn Walsh McLean, Hope Diamond. Evelyn Walsh McLean, great-grandmother of Louisvillian Evelyn Gregory, couldn't get enough bling in her life. As daughter of a man who had literally struck gold with one of the largest gold mines in America and wife of the heir to the Washington Post, she had plenty of spare cash to buy whatever she wanted, and she liked diamonds. After Evelyn's marriage in 1908, when she was just 22 years old, Evelyn and her new husband traveled to Europe for their honeymoon. While in Paris, they visited the Cartier showroom and purchased the 94-carat pear-shaped diamond known as the Star of the East for 600,000 francs, about $2.6 million today. Upon returning home, she had the following chat with her father. Walsh, did you buy a wedding present? Mrs. McLean, yes. Walsh, did you pay the duty? Mrs. McLean, no, I smuggled it. Walsh, her father says, you take the cake. But that was just the first interaction Evelyn had with the Cartier brothers. Unable to unload a spectacular 45-carat blue diamond, Pierre Cartier remembered Evelyn's name. She might be just the one who was wealthy enough to afford it, fanatical enough about diamonds to need it, and loony enough to disregard the curse that surrounded the stone. The interesting part about that curse is that Pierre Cartier made it all up. Perhaps he wasn't the best salesman, but he clearly knew the power of marketing, as does MJ, who has this on her website. Evelyn kept buying diamonds from Cartier. One day, while trying on a pair of earrings with pendants of diamonds, she requested that one more diamond be added to each. The designer suggested politely, "My dear madam, no lady would possibly wear earrings with more than these." To which Evelyn replied, "Damn it, I'm no lady. Put on more diamonds." He did. As tends to happen with spendthrifts, money problems loomed. Evelyn was said to have kept her jewels hidden in the back of an armchair, and whenever she needed cash, she'd rip them out, including the hope, and trot them down to the pawn shop, usually stuffed into the top of her dress. Sometimes Evelyn just didn't bother returning the hope to its nest in the back of the chair. She'd leave it lying around the house. During parties, it was reported that she tied the stone around the neck of her Great Dane, Mike, and let him roam the grounds. Or she'd engage her guests in a game of Find the Hope after she tucked it under a shrub in her garden. One scandalous story purported that Evelyn was spotted at the top of her grand stairway just before the start of a party wearing the Hope diamond and nothing else. Some say the cursed Hope diamond took its vengeance on the Walsh family. Following the early death of her brother, her eldest son was killed by a car when he was 9 years old. She divorced her philandering alcoholic husband and lost her only daughter to a drug overdose at 25. Was the Walsh family a victim of the curse, or was their fate attributable to the same kind of carelessness ascribed to Tom and Daisy Buchanan by F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby? Today, the Hope Diamond is the most famous gem in the National Museum of History in Washington, D.C. And I read that to give you an example of not only MJ's humor, but the sort of thing she has on her website and that she's dealing with in her series.
I was curious, I want to go back to the one picture here, Lila.
Lila, yes.
The name, tell me how you named her.
She has lilac in her.
That's okay. So do you name?
I do.
The one behind
I
me?
name all my quilts, but they're not necessarily women's names, but I do refer to my quilts as she and her. I don't know why, but they're my drama queens, I guess. This one is called Torch Song. It's inspired by one of the newest acquisitions at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian. It's a beautiful imperial topaz. Can't remember how many carats. I should know that. But it's an incredible, deep, rich red topaz that was found at the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show and donated by Dr. Coralie Wright Whitney. And so I wanted to make it big and dramatic, just as it is small and gorgeous.
Love that. We're going to get to more of your all's works here in just a second. Linda, a bit more about the book and the history that unfolds with quilts from women's history to Black history. I think there was another passage you wanted to read with the another image that we have to share that's behind you right now.
Yes. I wanted to read a couple of sentences, first from page 43, and that is the page that begins a chapter called Early Black Quiltmakers and Quilters. Those two sentences are, the ways in which free and enslaved Black women contributed to and influenced quilt making in Kentucky and elsewhere from the mid-18th century until the turn of the 20th century is difficult to document. Excuse me. While most quilt experts agree with quilt historian and author Barbara Brackman that, quote, with all the evidence, we can safely assume the slaves made quilts, confirmation of the scope of their handiwork is scanty, as is the history of any people's lives and art that went largely unrecorded and unattributed, not to mention often intentionally erased by chroniclers of the dominant culture. Then I'd like to go a little bit ahead here, and in the same chapter, there's something called the Bond Quilt Making Legacy, which I describe in detail in my book. But I want to talk about one of those women in the family who, in the 1930s, she was not a quilt maker herself, but she was responsible for designing this now very famous image, sometimes called the WPA quilt and sometimes called the Lazy Man quilt. Let me read about Ruth Clement Bond for a moment. Louisville-born Ruth Clement Bond, who died in 2005 at age 101, was the wife of Jane, that's the first Bond family enslaved woman quilt maker I discussed, her grandson, Jane's grandson Max. Ruth's prominent parents, George and Emma Clement, served respectively as a bishop of the African American Episcopal Zion Church and as the first Black woman to be named American Mother of the Year. Ruth earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in English literature at Northwestern University prior to serving as chair of the English department of Kentucky State College, now Kentucky State University. Ruth married J. Max Bond Sr. in 1931 and accompanied him to the West Coast, where he earned his doctoral degree in sociology. Next, the couple moved to northern Alabama. From 1934 to 1938, Max worked as the training supervisor for the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, Wheeler Dam Construction Workers, and Ruth took it upon herself to institute a home improvement project for the workers' wives. In conjunction with her efforts, she created quilt patterns for the wives who, in turn, taught Ruth to quilt. That Ruth's endeavors assisted the women with whom she worked is a given, but she also created extraordinary modern designs for pictorial quilts that emphasized Black Americans' enhanced New Deal opportunities. These designs, jaw-dropping art, simultaneously expanded discussions of social justice and equity and extended concepts related to quilt design. Of the 6 large quilts the women made in 1934, 3 survived, along with sample quilts. Black Power and Lazy Man, also known as Uncle Sam's Helping Hand and the TVA quilt, remain the most reproduced of the quilts. Black Power depicts a black fist clenching a lightning bolt, a strong visual symbol of Black Americans' efforts to improve their lives through their work. As she did with all the quilts, Ruth cut the patterns from paper and selected the fabric colors, and the workers' wives performed the quilting. Black Power, now in New York's Museum of Arts and Design, was quilted by Rosemarie Phillips Thomas. Lazy Man, also quilted by Thomas, was voted one of the 100 best quilts of the 20th century and now resides in the Michigan State University Museum. The energetic Matisse-like black figure that dominates the quilt against a background of palms and a setting sun is also caught between an abstract profile of a woman's body and an extended white hand. The man in the middle appears to be choosing between indulgence or even indigence and government-granted security.
Let's talk in general about the importance of quilts and the storytelling. MJ and Joe, why don't you weigh in on that?
My quilts are different from most quilts. Quilts normally capture events in the past, like a birth of a child, or a time in the military, or future events like weddings. My quilts are unique in that they record or chronicle long periods of time while they are happening, while these events are occurring. And they all tell stories. As you'll have an opportunity to look at my quilts later today, all of them deal with current events. The bright colors capture your attention, but when you begin to look at it, you are drawn into it, and you would be amazed at the detail and at the number of current events that exist in each of my quilts. So I don't know if that...
How about you, MJ?
I think that quilts have long been not just vehicles for storytelling, but vehicles for creativity. Storytelling can occur even, with this incredible graphic quilt behind us with recognizable objects. But there are quilts out there that are abstractions, and they're almost pictures without an image, right? Pictures without a subject. But they still represent a story, an internal story of that artist as he or she were putting it out into the world. And so I think, regardless of what your media is, artists tell stories in their quilting, in their painting, in their music, etc. So it's just another way for people for makers to make, right? I like to think, I'm from the Midwest, I'm from Nebraska, and we had the Oregon Trail, just 6 miles south of our little town. And the whole story of women, after they fed the animals and washed the clothes and taken care of the kids and put the family down to bed, then they would stay up by candlelight and sew. I don't know how they had the energy to do that. Certainly I don't. But to me, it talks about the passion these women had for expressing themselves through their medium. And I think we have oftentimes a long conversation about what is craft versus what is art. I really hope that we're way past that. Nancy Crow 30 years ago when she started the art quilt movement, those of us who are making art quilts realize, I think, that an artist can take anything that you put in their hands and turn it into art. A lot of times people now, especially a lot of people in the Louisville Area Fiber and Textile Association, LAFTA, are using found objects to put into their quilts. And that tells a story too,
right,
of a place, of a time. So to me, it's just another way to the makers to make. And for me, it's incredibly satisfying. I love the color, I love the line, I love the variety. When you talk about quilt making, in my view, there's something for everyone. There's something for everyone.
We've got a face behind us. I want to jump a little bit ahead because I want to make sure that we have time for everybody to show off their quilts here. There's another artist that's featured in Linda's book. Does anyone recognize her? I'm just
Yes.
curious in the crowd. I knew a few people would. She lives in Denver now. She made her mark when she lived in Louisville. Her name is Valerie White. She was the wife of Police Chief Robert White. Linda would prefer we say Chief White was the husband of quilt artist.
Yes.
Valerie White, and we're good with that. I remember doing a story on Chief White, and when I met her, she took me up in her studio that was at the top of her house, and I was just absolutely jaw-dropped by her spectacular work. So you have a passage, and then I'm going to show one because there was one that was very impactful that will show, this is my story, this is my song. So if you want to talk a little bit about Valerie White.
Yes, I'd like to read a little bit from my book about Valerie. This is when I interviewed her, she was talking about a series she had just finished, and this is how she began. I've just finished a series of pieces related to the theme of roots. My parents were avid gardeners. They always had a garden. They had a love and an appreciation for the soil. They were early green people. They taught their children to have a positive regard for the soil, and I loved it when they would pull a vegetable out of the ground, and some vegetables would be big with tiny root systems, and some vegetables would be small with huge root systems. So I became enthralled with literal roots. Literally, I was just taken with those roots. Pulling a vegetable from the ground was like Christmas when you get a package and you don't know what's in it. You pull up a vegetable and you don't know what you'll find. So I did my first series with vegetables. I started with carrots. I did one piece of work that I called the big ass beet. Then I began to think about people and about how they're rooted to each other. Then I moved from people and their roots to structures. We're rooted in our churches. We're rooted in our spirits. Now I'll put that aside, and I'm wanting to learn as much as I can about masks, about face painting culturally. What does painting a face in the Yoruba tribe mean as compared to maybe Adrinka symbols? My hope is to always create positive imagery. For so long it was hard to find positive imagery for African Americans. Perhaps it's due to my Howard days, to my early introduction to art, but I feel a responsibility to say something positive, to get people thinking positively. I love to include strong symbols and African designs in my work. Picasso used them, as did so many other artists, if you look back through art history. Some images tend to be very simple, but also so very strong. Right now I'm using some Adrinka symbols to create backgrounds. To date, the closest I've been to Africa is Morocco, but one of these days I'll get there. I don't want to go as a fancy tourist. I don't want to be dressed up. I want to be able to sit with men who print cloth. I want to observe who doesn't appear to be perched. I want my hands to get dirty. I dye my own cloth. I still take classes Nancy Crow, whom MJ was just referring to. Nancy Crow has a teaching studio in Ohio, and a few years ago I went to study there for a week, which I've done sometime since. And then I'd like to read one more part about Valerie. As I've mentioned, my current interest in exploring the cultural significance of face painting in my work, I don't know whether I'll just focus on African face painting or if I'll also explore what happened when Indians painted themselves. Eastern Indians painted themselves, Chinese people painted themselves. I'm interested in the significance of that and of what that brings, good luck or warding off evil. I've also been working with photographic images. I've had a phenomenal time here in Kentucky selling my work. Last year I sold 20 pieces. 2 other women and I had a show at the Carnegie Center, which is across the Ohio River in New Albany, Indiana. I had 14 pieces in that show, 12 of which I sold outright. Recently, I donated the 13th piece from that show to a breast cancer charity. Then a man called me and said, "I'm sure you've already sold everything from that show." When I told him which piece I had left, he told me that was the very piece his wife wanted, so I sold that one too. I have sold work from my website, but my website needs updating because everything on it now has just been sold. I don't have any problem selling my work, and that's a blessing. The only downside is that because I sell so much of my work, I'm always lacking for a body of work. Recently, I hit a dry spot in my work. I think I'd just been doing too much and needed a rest. So I talked with some artist friends. Sculptor Ed Hamilton is always giving me a nudge. He's one of my heroes. If Ed sees my work up, he'll say, "It's good work, baby." I'll say, "Ed, what do you think I need to do? Just be honest." And he'll reply, "Keep working, baby."
That sounds just like Ed, doesn't it?
It's just been in the last 2 weeks that I've decided what I want to do next, and I'm excited about it. My husband kept saying, "This is the longest time you've ever been away from your sewing machine." My kids kept saying, "So Mom, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm not doing anything. Leave me alone. I'm going to get there." It was scary not to have something going. Now I have a little pressure on me. Carolyn Mazlumi is curating a show with David Driscoll at the University of Maryland Art Department. It's a show featuring the work of quilt artists to whom Carolyn refers as the top 5 African-American quilt artists in this country. And she's invited me as one of those 5 to show my work. There's no pressure there, is there? Now I'm working every day. During the day, there's no one here at home except me. At about 3 p.m., I'll stop so I can make sure that my husband, Robert, has something to eat for dinner. As Louisville's chief of police, he eats junk all day, so I want to make sure he has something good to eat at night. He has to exercise because he eats like a crazy person. But I usually work through the night. I'm older now. I used to work from 12 a.m. till about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, but now I get tired around 2 or 3 a.m. If I start making stupid stitches, it's not the machine's fault, so I turn off the machine. I've been tossing with how I regard myself and with how other people regard me when it comes to the designation quilt maker or African American quilt maker. I am an art quilter who happens to be African American, but at the same time, my work is really about developing the Black aesthetic. So how I see myself and how others see me is really sort of a two-edged sword. I don't want people to recognize me simply because I'm African American. I want people to recognize me because they like my work. I want to share how important it is for me to leave a legacy. Sorry. This is my footprint. Maybe 50 years from now, I want my great-grandchildren to say, this quilt was made for me by my great-grandmother. My art quilts are my contribution. My oldest granddaughter is now 6. Her first name is Cecilia, which is my middle name. When she was at the quilt show at the Carnegie Center in New Albany, she pointed to one of my quilts and said to anyone who walked by, "You see that quilt? That's my grandmother's quilt." Someone asked her, "How do you know?" She said, "Do you see that C? That stands for Cecilia."
I love that. So a couple things after reading that passage I'd like to ask you all. Legacy in your footprint as quilt artists. What do you hope that will be? And I don't care who answers that first.
Legacy as a quilt artist. You know, I have to be honest with you. I'm just worried and concerned right now about getting a workout, you know, and doing the work. Right now, as a kind of a one-woman circus of, you know, an artist and pattern designer and traveling teacher, there's so many other things that kind of crowd my schedule, and I can't get to the work, right? My own work always comes last, it seems like. I don't know if people have had that same experience, but it's so frustrating. People say, "How do you balance it?" I'm like, I don't. And so, you know, legacy. I hope that people will appreciate my quilts in, you know, 50, 100 years. But if they don't, Rachel, it's okay, because I've had joy making them. And that's why we
That
make
personal
quilts.
joy
Exactly.
and the passion that you had. How about you, Joe?
Yeah, to piggyback on the last statement that she made, that was a time when I first started making quilts, that if someone saw my work and didn't necessarily like it, I was offended. But I've grown to understand that everybody has an opinion, and just because one person doesn't like what I do, it does not mean that it is not good. So I do it for the pure joy. If I didn't get money from it, I would still do it. Now, legacy. I have quilted, should I say embroidered, jackets for each of my grandchildren. And it's their birth certificates in stitchery.
Nice.
The date they were born, the time that they were born, where they were born, the doctor's name. Everything that's on a birth certificate is worked into it. And then I would stitch the grandparents on the mother's side, the grandparents on the father's side. It's just a whole detail, and then the sleeves of it. I'm hoping that one of my grandchildren, at least one of them, will take these quilts, the collection of quilts, and exhibit them and spread them around the United States. One of my grandchildren is studying business administration. The other is studying graphic arts. And I think both of those are necessary in order to do that. But if nobody ever goes beyond what we're doing today, just the joy of creating and and just letting my feelings come out through my needle and thread. That's a legacy.
I
for
love
me.
that. You both are very similar in what you feel about that. One other question, Joe, then I'm going to have you get up and start showing some of your work. I was listening with Valerie, and she said, you know, some of the end goal is to sell the work. Same thing for you all? Is it hard to part with that work when you sell it? Would you prefer it to be shown somewhere? What is the end goal?
All of the above.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I have a number of my pieces are with collectors, you know, around the country. I have a piece at the National Quilt Museum, and I have a piece at the International Quilt Museum. I would like to focus on getting my art into the world a little bit more, and that's something I'd like to focus on. When Valerie said she's sold, you know, I'm like, good for her, because selling your art is some of the hardest work that you can do. So,
How about you, Joe?
Yeah, I don't sell my quilts. I do not. I've sold a few pieces of work, but I have not sold one of my quilts. I earn money by doing workshops and working with children, teaching them life lessons through quilting. So quilting is not a way that I earn money. And then if you think it takes 5 years to do one, I would starve.
Would it be difficult to part with one of those?
No, I don't think it's been difficult to part with them, but I just haven't been successful in finding people who want to pay for the amount of time that goes into creating one.
Well, we're going to get it to President Obama, so
Yeah, we'll see what
that's the
happens.
goal here.
Yeah.
I do think that, to echo that, the Thai quilt, in my view, is a national treasure.
Great.
I mean, literally 630 references to people, places, things over the first 4 years of America's first black president. It belongs in the library, and there's going to be a way that we're going to do that.
And
Maybe we get a group of people together to purchase it and then donate it together to the Obama Library.
We're going to
But
formulate a plan.
We're going to do it.
There's
That
gonna-
would be
there's gonna
great.
be a
That
plan.
would be great. But
Yeah.
the joy of creating is what turns me on and makes me work. And I was listening to a reading about Valerie. When I first met my wife, I would sit up from the time she would go to bed, and I would stay up to 5 o'clock in the morning just stitching. And this was 7 days a week. I'm a little older now, and I can't stitch that long. I stitch about 5 hours a day now.
Okay.
And
And your wife is here, and MJ's husband is here, and Linda's, so family is here, and I know your son as well. One thing that I did have to point out, because we had this conversation when you came here to visit, because we mentioned Ed Hamilton. And you know, you and Ed are good friends, and there's so much about you. When I talk to you, when I look at you, I mean, you could be brothers.
everybody that sees me calls me Ed. And they call him Joe, but it's good.
So
Ed
you
is-
all have a joke about that, but
Yeah, and Ed is quite not only a great artist, but he's a great person. If you don't know Ed Hamilton, if you get to know him, I mean, he's a gentle, wonderful human being. And I'm
as
so
are
happy
you.
that I know
That's
him.
why when I talk to both of you, I'm like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it really is incredible. It really is. Now, I'm going to have you take off your lavalier mic, and then we're going to go over and start showing some of your work here. Because I want to save time for a couple questions from the audience as well. I think we have a handheld mic that I can hold it for you, or you can hold it. You tell me how you want to do
I
that.
think if you would hold it, I'll raise this up a
Yeah,
little bit. and
absolutely.
it will
Can you
give-
all hear him without the microphone?
Can you hear me okay? No?
Okay.
How about this? Is that
Okay,
I'll
I'm gonna
make
stay
sure.
close to you.
Okay.
Would you like some help holding that up?
Oh, that'd be great.
Maybe we have some people from the audience who would like to help. Anybody from the audience?
Oh, they're all coming. Thank you. Perfect. Oh my gosh, we have more helpers. Excellent. All right, that way you can put this real close to your mouth and talk a little bit about it.
Okay.
You want to come around front, Joe, so we
Yeah, let
can
me
see while
come.
you're talking? Let's do that.
This particular piece is called The Other Side of the American Dream. And you can see a little black guy on a skateboard. And on the top of his hat it says, "Think big, work smart, move forward." Well, inside of this you will see words like renew your mind daily, or it will play tricks on you. If you look a little further, it says, touch my mind, see what is in me, feel life in me, be aware there may be more than you can see in me. And I'm just trying to express how we can look at people and come away with preconceived ideas and never having talked to the person to see who and what they really are. So then there's things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's all stitched into it. You have to be very close to see the detail in it. But I hope that gives you some idea. All of my quilts have neckties, and the neckties simply are here to, as MJ calls her quilts, but she, my neckties signify masculinity. They are made by a man, okay? Let me pull another one out just for quickly so we can see as many as possible. This is the Obama tie quilt.
Everyone's excited to see this one.
Let's see if we can hold it up. Okay? It's all about events of people, things, and places that happened in his first 4 years. And I'll just point out a couple for you. You remember Occupy Wall Street? Remember that movement? Then I said here, Winter in America. There was unemployment, people's dreams and aspirations had been given up, but Barack Obama seemed to have inspired other African American people. And I believe in my mind, not only African Americans, but he inspired people all around the world that if you believe and if you really work at it, you can do it. And that's a part of my deal. There are other words and names of people and things that happened during that time in this particular quilt. And then I have another one that I brought.
Is the writing stitched?
The writing is stitched. Everything in it is stitched, and every stitch has a knot tied in it. And most people think they are French knots. They are not French knots. They are Joe's knots. And they are easier to make than French knots. This quilt chronicles the work of Miles Davis. It chronicles his work from the early days of his life, Birth of the Cool, when he played with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk. And it goes all the way through Kind of Blue when he went into the cool stage. And then it talks about the movie that was made about Miles Davis. And then it goes on to show when he went from jazz to world music. And Miles Davis has always been someone that I admire. So when I stitch like Miles Davis played. Now you say, how do you do that? Well, Miles Davis surrounded himself with very bright and creative musicians. And I surround myself with quilting friends such as MJ, Martha here, she's one of my close friends, Angelique. These are friends of mine, and they do wonderful things with quilting. And although we don't do the same kind of quilting, we can respect each other's differences and we can complement each other. So that's what I like. I use applique. These, if you look at all 6 of these were stitched on separate fabric. And then I appliqued those pieces onto a larger piece, and then I embroidered all around it. But every stitch has a knot tied in it. And I admire my wife's patience. She can, I sit and stitch, and it's just amazing.
Hey, Joe, I did want to ask you a question because we mentioned that question at the beginning of the program. If this quilt could tell a story, what would it be?
Yeah.
What would you say for the Obama tie quilt?
The Obama tie quilt captures people, events, and things that happened during his first 4 years. And from my lens, from my perspective, I wanted to capture as much as I could of what was going on during the time, not so much his political views and that sort of thing, but the response to his being the first African-American president of the United States of America.
Very good. And MJ, did you want to get up and talk about this quilt?
That would be terrific.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you to everybody who helped with that. That was perfect.
Thank you for that. That was wonderful, friend. I'm MJ. This is my quilt called Torch Song. She's 120 inches tall, which makes her 10 feet tall and 4.5, I think almost 5 feet wide. I think I'll go over here because I'm close to that speaker and we might screech a little bit. Is that all right? Gosh, I wanted to create quilts inspired by the National Gem Collection at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Jeffrey Post, who is the curator, and my friend Lori Watt, who happens to be a gem dealer up in Maysville, kind of brought us together, and he was like, go for it. It is the people's collection, so anybody can do it. It's not just me or et cetera. Any of us can use that as inspiration. And so the first piece I did was inspired by a beautiful cognac pear-shaped gem called the Victoria Transvaal. Giant, beautiful cognac colored gemstone. And I wanted to go more abstract, really kind of dive into the interior of the gem. But with this one, because the imperial topaz is so gorgeous, it has that rich glowing color, I wanted to really show the entirety of the gemstone. And it's almost a portrait, right? Almost a portrait of a gemstone. My technique, by the way, is it's basically traditional piecing. Basically, if you can take 2 pieces of fabric, put them right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I know those of you who are quilt makers here can do that, you can make my quilts. The secret is freezer paper. It's that wonderful product that has a waxy substance on the back. When I first started thinking about how am I going to do these gemstones, I mean, I had a million questions, and I spent about 7 years figuring out how to do it. I'm not exactly the brightest bulb in the thing, a little slow learner. But I realized, once I realized what you can do with freezer paper, it basically has that waxy substance on the back that when you hit it with a hot iron, you can put it on fabric and it will stay. You can remove it, it won't leave a substance, and you can adhere it. So basically, freezer paper is one of those things where you can chart out your entire design, where every single piece is a different shape, a different size, a different color. You can code all the pieces so that when you have all those little weird quadrilaterals cut apart, you have the visual clues to put them back together, that confidence. And so that's basically how I made this gal. In terms of her story, gosh, you know what I think I wanted to do was just tell a story about color. Because the imperial topaz is so rich and so beautiful, I wanted to try to capture that. I used 30 different fabrics of reds and corals and purples and oranges. It's Kona 100%. It's not hand dyed or hand painted. I did use commercial available fabric for that. But I wanted to tell the story of glow and sparkle. One of the things my quilts have taught me is how to make quilts. Sparkle is value contrast. You put the lightest lights and the darkest darks together, and they literally they exalt one another, is what Joseph Albers used to say. So if you want your own quilts, regardless of inspiration, to sparkle, put your lightest lights and your darkest darks together because they enhance one another. The way to make your quilts glow is to take a piece of fabric with high saturation, meaning it has very little gray in it, and surround it with fabric that has more gray in it. And what that will do is the contrast between the low saturated color and the high saturated color will make that high saturated color just glow. Think about embers in a burning fire. When you see that bright orange and that bright, almost white pink, super hot, super saturated, and then around it, it's the gray ash. And that's what makes it glow. So that's the kind of story I like to tell with some of my quilts.
I love that. I want to make sure that we get time for if you all have any questions of our quilt artists up here and author Linda. there are a few people we thought might be here today. Is there anyone in the audience? Now, I know Joanne is here, so let me go to Joanne. Joanne Weiss? There you are. You want to
Yay.
stand up? Yeah, and then go ahead and, this is the quilt that is featured in the book, and Linda has just a short thing to say about that.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that Louisville fiber artist Joanne Weiss is a past president of LOFTA, that was mentioned by MJ a few minutes ago, the Louisville Area Fiber and Textile Artists Group. And she's a member of the River City Fiber Artists, a small fiber artist critique group to which Valerie White also belonged. Her inspirations are spirituality, the environment, and social justice. I will add that Joanne and MJ work together in Louisville outside of the quilt world in the realm of social services. So what many of us say about Louisvillians experiencing just 2 degrees of separation, not 6, is more like 1/2 of a degree of separation in the quilt world. Less than that sometimes.
So we'll go. Is there anybody else that who is recognized in the book who is here? We weren't sure if everybody was going to show up, so okay, that's perfect. Now I'm going to take that from you, MJ. Who has a question that you all would like to ask any of our 3 panelists? Anybody? Yes, ma'am. If you want to go ahead and stand up, and then if we can't hear. Here you go. Can I hand you the mic?
Joe,
Yes.
how much is it gonna take for us to get Obama's quilt to his library?
You know, I haven't considered that yet, but I'm certain we can come up with a figure. I don't know yet. I don't know.
I guess part of that question might be, we might have some people in this room who want to help you achieve that goal. So maybe there's something we can do after this. I would say if there is anybody who's interested in helping achieve that, should they reach out to you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you want to, I don't know, or you can call the Fraser. I will get you in touch with Joe. But I think that might be good because I think this has to happen, right?
Right. And I would think before I could quote a price, I would need to have the quilt appraised so I would have some idea of what the market value is. And at that point, I could come up with a fair price.
Does President Obama know the quilt is available?
I don't know. I don't know. When I was in Washington, D.C., and I showed that quilt, and a person that saw it says, I worked close in that office, and I know people that work with President Biden, and I think that I can get him together with you, but I haven't heard any more. So I don't know if President Obama knows that I made it or not. But I think
Emailing. Yeah, trying to email the library, and I'm sure they're just swamped right now, but it's going to be persistent, just
But
contacting them.
I was just sitting here in my brain going, who do we know? Who do we know? Former Mayor Jerry Abramson worked.
Absolutely.
Have you reached out to him?
There you go.
I would love that.
Well, we're going to make that connection. I was thinking about him, and then I've got one other person who I know has contacts as we've been speaking. So,
I might be able to find out who their collections manager is.
oh, and Tish is saying she can find out the collections manager.
Excellent.
Great.
Excellent.
So we will be making all of these connections to make this happen, and we'll keep everybody. We'll have a party when this happens. Wouldn't that be great? And when I'm thinking, I'm like, oh, we know that person. We know. All right. Anybody else have a question? Yes. Did you want to go ahead and shout it out, and then?
I can shout it out.
Oh, good. Thank you.
We heard about your inspiration. This was so beautiful. I'm just wondering if you don't mind sharing what's next for either of you, for both of you. As far as inspiration.
I just started one this month, and the title of this quilt is, Hey, You. And it's going to make statements that all of us should recognize in the scheme of things in the world that we're now living in. So.
I think what's next for me is there's a wonderful group of photographers around the world who do inclusions inside of gemstones. So the way that the technology has progressed with micro photography is incredible. And my goal is to start making quilts that are really abstract and really deal with those inclusions and make them look like quilts like Kandinsky, right? Or some of those abstract expressionists back then. That's really where I want to go next. So.
Yes, ma'am.
Approximately how long does it take you to make a quilt this size?
Average
Yeah.
time for me to create a quilt is 4.5 to 5 years.
Wow.
And I'm working 5 to 6 hours per day.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Linda, are you working on a book?
Yes, I am.
You want to tell us what it's about, or?
I can. I'll try to do the short version. I have another contract with the University Press of Kentucky, and it's another very Kentucky-centric book. It came out of some research I was doing for this book, but it's not related to quilts. It is a book about the Kentucky mineral spa resorts that proliferated from the last quarter of the 18th through the first quarter of the 20th century. Kentucky had more than any other state in the country. And lots of themes come out of that that are very unexpected. There's the health approach, there's the social approach, but there is also a lot in terms of what happened with enslaved people in a border state when people from the Deep South were coming to trade slaves here while going to the spas. And the spas created a whole other aristocracy after, in the postbellum era, or antebellum era rather, after the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War were over, who was going to be the next aristocracy after they just got rid of one. They met at spas to create another one. So,
Any idea when that one might be?
no, because I'm just finishing.
Is it going to be, are we on Joe's timeline? Am I looking at, are we thinking 3 to
Well,
4
I hope-
years, or?
It's due in a year and a half.
Okay.
with the press, so I've just about finished the research. Now I have to do the writing, but I've been sort of otherwise engaged in the last few months.
I also want to let people know that Linda's book has been getting national publicity, so shout out to her for that. And it's been wonderful. Just as we wrap up, I want everybody to feel free to stay, to look at, you can't appreciate these quilts until you get up close to them, right? And see all of the detail in that. It has been my privilege, like I said, I did several stories with Joe and his work with children, which is just wonderful. So much that you do to inspire children and just teach them these valuable lessons of, finishing a project and all of those things. So thank you for that. And MJ, my path came across MJ after my father passed away. And we had saved all of his clothes and didn't know what to do with it. And I said, we want to tell his story. And that goes back to the piece about the quilt. We gave MJ everything from ties to boxer shorts to his favorite shirts. And she put a quilt together for each of my siblings. And incorporated some photographs in them to tell my dad's story. And it is one of the most meaningful possessions that we all have. My mother passed last February, and you don't know it, but I'm going to be talking to you. I'm going to be talking to you again, just because, again, what that can mean, and like you said, the inspiration and the stories they tell. Everybody please stay, talk to Joe, MJ, and Linda. She's here to sign books. Our collections manager, Tish, is out here. She has some quilts from our collection. A round of applause for the wonderful talent in this room. Thank you all for braving the cold, but I think they're so worth it, don't you all? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all, and please feel free to stay and stick around and ask questions and get your book signed if you have them. And thank you, Fraser Book Club. And just so everybody knows, we have a few copies of Linda's book in our store on the first floor. If you would like to go purchase and then come back, she will sign.